My name is Christopher Eastman. I'm presenting with Andy Acker, who's a fellow local government specialist at the Department of State's Division of Local Government Services. And Monica Ryan, one of our other colleagues, is going to be monitoring the Q&A. And we are also joined by John Furtado, who's said more than my other colleagues so far this meeting. He's kind of the tech backup. And the star of the show this week is, as we had Jeff Kehoe from Ag and Markets last week, is Brad Wenskowski, who works in the Floodplain Management Unit of the Division of Water at the Department of Environmental Conservation. Did I get that right, Brad?
Sure did.
Good. And we'll thank you for joining us. We're really happy to have you. Brad's the real expert on this subject, and we're all generalists, but we kind of see it from a broad view as planners, Andy, Monica, and I. And floodplain regulation, when it comes to planning to prevent damage from floods, it's really, this is what planning is all about. Planning around hazards like floodplains, and allowing floodplains to do what nature intended is really the essence of good planning. I'm going to advance the slide to our first here, our floodplain regulation for local review boards. And to build where it's appropriate and not to try to overtake or dominate nature is the essence of planning. And so it's totally consistent when we talk about good planning to talk about not building in the floodplain and floodplain mitigation for buildings that are in the floodplain. And of course, we've had some extreme storms in recent years that have resulted in billions of dollars of damage across the country, but all over New York State. The series of storms in the beginning of the last decade, the 2010s, 2011, when we had Hurricanes Lee and Irene in upstate New York, eastern New York. This is Delaware County in eastern New York, I think, as a result of Hurricane Lee. Delaware County got hit pretty hard by both of those hurricanes, and then Superstorm Sandy was shortly after. And then, of course, we had some extreme storms. We've been having extreme storms in the summer. And so what happens? Sometimes we've had, Monica describes a big storm in her town. I remember that one a few years ago in the middle of summer, and there was damage to places that weren't even in a floodplain. It was like a 1,000-year storm event. And in this one, you know, we say, you've got the quote there, flood losses. Floods are acts of God, but flood losses are largely acts of man, and that's not building in the path of floodwaters is that's not good planning. And there are places where floodwaters have natural courses of water have been changed, and so that's changed where floods occur. But there are places where changes have been made. There have been maps, and we should know better than to build in certain places. And we're going to talk about that over the course of this the next couple hours as we go through these slides. So remember this photo, by the way, because this is a place in Delaware County where I think we have a photo, maybe not of the exact same spot, but a historical photo of the undeveloped floodplain, and you can really see a little later on how floodplains are supposed to work. And it was really instructive to me when some of these graphics were given in a presentation a number of years ago, that this one was partially built from I came to understand a lot better how floodplain regulation should work and how floodplains ought to work. So there has been for years an increase in population growth in flood-prone areas. Years ago, cities and villages were built on rivers and streams for transportation and water bodies for transportation, energy, waste disposal, and much of them traditionally actually outside of floodplains. A lot of 19th century development, not all of it, but I did some research a number of years ago to see what historic districts, what different historic districts across the country, how they were handling elevating their buildings in flood zones. And I wasn't able to find all that many places, all that many historic districts that were actually really in the path of in the most vulnerable spots. It was later that a lot of the building in flood zones occurred, in floodplains occurred. So much of the 19th, 18th, and 19th century development was actually, it was close to water, but not right in floodplains. But waterfront real estate in the last 100 years ago is seen as very desirable, and floodplain development started increasing over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st. And there's a quote here, as you can see, this graphic isn't totally up to date. It goes up to 2016 because there was a report and an article with this convenient graphic that we used a few years ago, where floodplain development had slowed down a little bit. And there's a recent report that we found in a journal called Earth's Future that says, according to this article, since 2016, development in floodplains has actually slowed some. So that's good news in response to some serious flooding events and a great deal of loss of property in those years, as we can see here, and the real extreme taxing of the National Flood Insurance Program, which rates have started to go up in recent years, and we're going to talk about that in slides to come. But there was a line in an article, the article I think that this graphic came from, the National Resources Defense Council said that the nation is spending billions to move people to flood-prone areas, and to keep them living there, we've gotten what we've paid for. Of course, that wasn't the intention of the National Flood Insurance Program, but that's some of what we have. So why regulate floodplain development prior to, and we're going to go into a little history here, prior to 1968, there was no insurance for those moving into floodplains. And the National Flood Insurance Act created the National Flood Insurance Program in 1968 in response to massive flooding in the 1950s and 60s. And that program subsidized insurance for those living in municipalities that agreed to minimum building and zoning regulations in flood-prone areas. The primary standard was that the lowest floor, including the basement, should be above the elevation of where there was a 1% chance of a flood. So, and we're going to go through, we're going to expand on all these points on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but we turn to local governments to be the regulators of development in their flood zones, because it is at the local level where the power is to regulate the use of land. So it's ultimately up to local governments. They're on the front line of protecting their natural resources and planning for their futures. So we work together, the state and the National Flood Insurance Program, as Brad will tell us in greater detail in subsequent slides. But it comes down to the local level. Ultimately, the state has a role, as we'll discuss, but it ultimately falls to local governments to regulate. The floodway, just a few definitions here, is the most restricted area for development. None can proceed without an engineering analysis that can prove that proposed development will not increase the base flood elevation anywhere else in the floodway, or anywhere else. So that's for anything happening in the floodway, and this is a graphic that really allows us to envision we can associate these terms with a graphic. The normal channel, the floodway, where the water first floods, and the flood fringe area, which is what we think of as the 100-year floodplain in most places. And the fill on one side allows the house, and the flood fringe is where the water will, on the right side, is where water will collect and eventually go down. So the floodway is the river or stream channel plus the immediate adjacent land to carry floodwater. The flood fringe area around that, the 100-year floodplain, has a 1% chance of flooding in a given year. And the flood fringe can be developed as long as structures are elevated and above the base flood elevation. Just some acronyms here, and you can turn back. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention in our housekeeping introduction earlier on, John Furtado should sent to everybody the slide packet with an attachment just before we started, so check your emails for, if you haven't seen it already, there should be a copy of this handout in your email, so you can follow along, take notes, print it out if you like, refer back to it after the course. But I was going to say, you can turn back to this slide for the acronyms if you can't keep track of what we're saying. And I hope we covered all of the acronyms that Brad might speak of. He knows this stuff cold and sometimes goes a little fast. You lost me briefly a few days ago when we had a conversation about this stuff, Brad. So everybody can refer to, and even I use some of these acronyms here. So just before we move on, this is what some of the acronyms stand for. We'll refer back to them as we go through. And then the flood zones themselves, which we probably won't say a whole lot about. I know I won't, but Brad might. Zone A is the highest risk of flooding. And it's where it's the 100-year flood zone, where and a lot of the buildings in Zone A were there before the National Flood Insurance Program, which had rates and still does. The rates for those structures that preceded the National Flood Insurance Program are more subsidized. Those settlements that existed before the program, before the firms, the flood insurance rate maps, have a higher degree of subsidization. It's those structures that have come later that have a lower subsidy than the ones that were that preceded the program. But the homeowners and businesses with federally backed mortgages must purchase flood insurance if they're in Zone A. Zones V and VE are high-risk coastal areas and that have the additional hazard from storm waves, and Zone D is where flood risk has not been determined, and B and X is between the 100 and 500-year flood zones, and C and X are places with minimal flood hazard that are above the 500-year flood level. I'm going to turn the course, the control of the screen and the floor, as they say, over to Brad to maybe say a little more about these zones.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Just to make sure you can hear me.
You're clear, but your volume's just a little low, and yes,
right.
We can hear you.
Is this a little bit better?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the flood zones and message received, Chris. I'll try to not use acronyms where I can, avoid it. So depending on your community, where you are in the state, you're going to have different flood insurance rate maps. Some communities, potentially attendees on this call, have maps from when the program first started back in, so your maps might be effective late 70s, early 80s, and there might not have been a new product published that's gone effective since that time. If that's the case, then the zones in your maps are going to be a little bit different than zones on newer digital products that have come out in the past, say, 10 or 15 years. On the older maps, Zone A, like Chris said, is where that's our regulatory flood hazard area or a special flood hazard area. And that's where we would expect the highest regulatory level of flooding to occur, which is that 1% annual chance flood, or what's commonly referred to as a 100-year flood. You then have Zone B, which is your moderate flood hazard area between 100 and 500-year floods, and then you'd have a Zone C, which is outside of either of those, where we wouldn't really expect flooding hazards except for very extreme events. Now on the new maps, or newer maps, they changed those zone designations. Don't ask me why, because I personally thought ABC was straightforward enough, but they changed it to A remains the same. But now there's an X shaded, so it'll say X in parentheses shaded and an X unshaded. X shaded is the same as B. It just means that you're still within the 500-year flood. And then X unshaded is the same as what used to be C, meaning you're outside of any of the regulatory or identified or mapped flood hazard areas. Then the coastal high hazard areas have V zones, and on this slide where we see V and VE, that the difference there is Zone V are approximate zones, and actually in New York I don't think we have any Zone V. All of our coastal areas have been mapped with base flood elevations. So on your map there should be a number in each zone that shows you the elevation that we would expect the water to reach during that event, during that 100-year flood. And same thing for Zone A. A means approximate, and AE would be a detailed zone where, again, we would have base flood elevation to use when you're evaluating development. So let's see if I can advance this slide. So the special flood hazard area, again, is that 100-year floodplain. We do try to, and this is probably going to be something that we all try to do. This has always been it's been the message since I started in this program, and it continues to be. The 100-year floodplain is a bit misleading. The terminology can convey this sense of this happens once every 100 years. And I've actually heard people say, well, we had that flood last year, so we're good. And we know that that's not the case. We know there's a 1% annual chance every single year. So this year there's a 1% chance, next year there's a 1% chance, and so on. And you could very well have 2 of those events in consecutive years. You could have 2 of those events in 1 year. So we do try to, when we're communicating with the public, we try to convey that message, and I think in the next slide or 2 actually conveys it a little bit better than even that. But like I said in the beginning of this slide, everybody calls it the 100-year floodplain. FEMA's trying to get away from that terminology. Most professionals in floodplain management try to get away from that terminology, but it's probably, it's just a lot easier to say 100-year floodplain than 1% annual chance floodplain. It's just the way it is. But the special flood hazard area is just that. It's where we would expect that 1% annual chance flood to occur. Any buildings within this zone have to be reviewed for and issued a floodplain development permit to determine whether or not they're being constructed in a way that's resilient to flooding and flood damage. So
well said, Brad. Thank you.
A little bit better to convey this information to the public is to use, most people have a mortgage. Most people take out, I shouldn't say most people have a mortgage, I should say most people would take out a mortgage, take out a 30-year mortgage. Maybe they take out a 15-year mortgage, but 30-year tends to be a very common period that people choose to pay their mortgage back. And if we take that 1% annual chance and extend it out over 30 years, we're looking instead of 1 out of 100, we're looking at closer to 1 out of 4 chance. And so, again, when communicating with members of the public, people who do have mortgages, if you were to tell them, if you build in this zone or if you move into a house within this zone, you're looking at a 1 in 4 chance of experiencing this flood, this 100-year flood. And I think most people, even if I told you you had a 1 out of 100 chance of winning the lottery, I don't know that there's anyone that wouldn't buy that lottery ticket. If you then say, well, what if you have a 1 in 4 chance to win the lottery? Now there's definitely nobody who's not buying that lottery ticket. Everyone's buying that ticket. But we don't see the same type of behavior when we're talking about purchasing flood insurance in these higher risk areas. People tend to, when they don't need to, there's less people purchasing these policies. And that was evident in the early part of the program. It wasn't a mandatory purchase requirement. That came a little bit later as part of a separate act. And we could see with that the rate of adoption or the rate of policies being purchased went up significantly, showing that when people were given the choice, they weren't always choosing to do that. So it's a little bit of kind of just communicating what this means, because it's very easy, again, to see something that says 100-year and you think, it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen to me. That's, I think, what a lot of people think, until they get flooded and then they realize, oh, these maps were, somebody was telling me this for a reason. So in New York State, we've got, we use the maps that are published by FEMA, and they all display the base flood elevation. And again, that's the elevation to which the water, we would expect the water to reach during the flood. And it's referenced to a vertical datum, so it's not going to necessarily say, at this area, you're going to see 1 foot of water. It instead is going to be a number, and I'm sure probably most people in most of the attendees here are familiar with this concept. You have a vertical datum, it's referenced to that. And we'll say reference to mean sea level, but it's not really, but close enough. So if your land is 100 feet above sea level or above the vertical datum, the reference level, and the flood is going to be, we would expect 1 foot of water, then the base flood elevation would be 101. It's going to be 101 feet, and then that would just mean that the elevation of the water would be a foot above the elevation of the land at that particular location. So if you're building there, you would want to protect that construction to that level to meet the minimum requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program. New York State adds 2 feet on top of that, which we call freeboard, which is really just a margin of safety that allows for errors in the map. It allows for, at the time, it directly correlated to reductions in flood insurance. So for every foot that you elevated, you were seeing a reduction in your premiums. That is still not untrue, but the relationship is less clear than it used to be. But take the flood insurance out of it, you're still lowering your risk of having damage to the structure during the flood by elevating a little bit higher. So this kind of shows what we're talking about here. We have the different flood levels, and the 1% annual chance is what we tend to focus on because that's the regulatory level. But the 10-year level is used for other purposes. I know Department of Health uses that for different, as a reference for different things. And the 500-year level is used, or at least should be used by communities for locating critical facilities, things like hospitals or your emergency services, or places where you wouldn't expect people to be, either they can't evacuate themselves all that quickly, or it would be difficult to do so. But for regulatory and for what we're looking, what the program applies to everything across the board is the 1% annual chance. And in this drawing here, what we see is the lowest adjacent grade of that structure is above the 100-year flood elevation. Lowest adjacent grade is exactly what it sounds like. It's the lowest part or portion of that building that's touching the ground. So you're going to have likely 4 corners. If the plot was perfectly flat, they'd all be the same, but they very rarely, or if never, is. So there's going to be one corner that's a little bit lower or a lot lower than the rest, or maybe one side is lower than the rest if it's a walkout. And that's the elevation that a surveyor or an engineer or a floodplain administrator would be looking at to fill out an elevation certificate, and that's the elevation that's compared to the base flood elevation to determine whether or not the structure itself is in or out of the floodplain. If the lowest adjacent grade is at or above the base flood elevation, then we would consider that structure to be out of the floodplain, out of the flood hazard area, and therefore it wouldn't need to meet the regulations of the NFIP or the flood provisions of the Uniform Code. If the opposite is true, and that lowest adjacent grade is below the BFE, now it's in the floodplain and has to meet all those requirements, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Now, to kind of step back as an overview of the National Flood Insurance Program, it is a federal program. It is administered by local communities. The federal government provides risk identification, so they publish the maps. They conduct the studies, or have the studies conducted, but by their partners, to identify the areas where we want to be regulating development to reduce flooding losses. And those are the same maps that local communities use, they're the same maps that we use, they're the same maps that FEMA uses. There are other products out there that are more advisory, but when you're working in this program, if you're a floodplain administrator or if you're working with your floodplain administrator, you want to make sure that you are referencing to the regulatory maps, because there's a lot of, like I said, there's other products out there and even other interpretations of the regulatory products themselves. And by that, I mean you might have a county mapper, and that mapper might have a flood hazard layer that you can turn on and off. But in those communities where we have still paper maps, still from the 80s, the process of taking those boundaries and digitizing them and putting them into that mapper That's not a perfect process. The maps are already out of date. They were, at the time, likely developed with much less accuracy. At least the topography that was used at the time was, I'm sure, less accurate than the LiDAR that we use today. And then the process itself, to take it from a paper-based product to put it into something digital, there's a lot of room for error there. So, and there's, like I said before, other digital layers as well that might just be kind of floating around. So we've seen, visiting with communities, there's a number of counties in New York that we're aware of that are using layers that are not accurate to the flood hazard layers. And so I want to use this opportunity to just caution you on that. It's a great tool. It's much easier to work with, like a county mapper, than to open up a paper map and try to interpret it that way. And this really is just an issue where you're in a community, mostly the north part of New York, that's still waiting for the updated maps. Not so much with newer communities that have newer digital products, but you always want to, you can use that as a tool to screen your development or whatever you're reviewing, but you should always make sure you're referencing back to the actual regulatory product. So those products that we're talking about, those regulatory maps, those are adopted into a local law for flood damage prevention. And that's the community's way of agreeing to enforce the National Flood Insurance Program and agreeing to keep development safe as possible. Safe is not a great word to throw around with this type of thing, because there's some level of risk to everything, right? But we try to do our best to minimize risk and mitigate any identified areas where there's maybe the community has taken on a little bit more risk than they should have or want to in the future. So I think we've kind of gone over this a little bit, but every structure that has a federally backed mortgage requires flood insurance. That was built into the program after the inception of the program. And so if you have either a residential or non-residential structure, if you have a mortgage on it, it's federally backed, you're likely going to get a letter from the lender saying you have to have flood insurance because they're required to do that. And there are ways there are ways to kind of take a closer look at whether or not a building should or shouldn't be in the floodplain. It might be a little bit outside of the scope of this, but just so you know, there's if you're looking at letters of map amendment, there's resources about that available online, or you could also reach out to our office to go through that process. We see a lot of that, again, with these maps that are a little bit older. It's kind of the first step to see if verify if something actually is in the floodplain. If you are either a floodplain administrator or you're a chief elected official that's, or just community as a whole that's not enforcing the program, really not reviewing development, not enforcing the standards that were agreed to in that local law, you risk being kicked out of the program. And if that happens, at first there's a probation period, and that is, I believe, about 6 months to a year at most that communities will have to bring themselves back into good standing with the program. And then during that time, there's a surcharge that's added to every flood insurance policy within the municipality. It's not much. It's $50. I don't think that's changed since since it was first introduced, but it's enough potentially to, if somebody's paying their bill, to ask, why is my bill a little bit higher? And then potentially, they would be asking the community why that's the case and why they're not in good standing with the program. If after the 6 months or a year or whatever period of time that's given to the community to bring the program back into good standing, if they fail to do so, they could be suspended from the program, and then flood insurance wouldn't be available. Any federally backed mortgages would be unavailable if they're located in the flood hazard area. So you would have a very difficult time with real estate within the special flood hazard area. So it's obviously not something that any of us want to see. Meanwhile, you'd have people at increased risk of incurring flood damages and no real way to protect against that loss. They'd be liable for the damages, and the amount of damage that a flood can cause could be prohibitively expensive very quickly. So looking at a little bit closer look at the different types of foundations, the different types of development we have in flood hazard areas. We have on this, we can see the base flood elevation. We've got our grade. We've got, in this example, we have a structure that's elevated on fill, which is something that you can permit. You would first want to, this is really probably more, this maybe should be moved to the end, but this was, I'm sure, a FEMA drawing. This is a little bit more involved than the others here. So this, you would fill, and then the applicant would apply for what's called a letter of map revision based on fill. And if they receive that, then the map doesn't change, but they would have this letter that says, now that you've brought in this fill, the elevation is above the base flood elevation. So you're at that point technically out of, you've elevated yourself out of the flood hazard area. You still don't want to put, you still want to keep your lowest floor, which includes basement, above the base flood elevation. And this may even in the future not be allowed. So we definitely recommend proceeding with caution when you're working with this type of development, when you're filling in a floodplain and then putting structures on top of that fill. That's like I said, as of right now and as of the, since the program has been around, it's something that's allowed. You just want to make sure it's done right and that they get that letter of map revision based on fill before they place the structure on top of the fill, because they do risk, if they say do it all, they put the fill in, put the structure in, they drop a basement in there, they risk FEMA not issuing the letter of map revision based on fill, and then they're stuck, they're still in the floodplain, and they'd be, everything that comes along with that would apply. The next example we have here is a crawl space. So you have your building, you have your enclosed space underneath that, and we have flood openings, which have pretty specific requirements. They allow for the automatic entry and exit of water, floodwaters through the foundation, and but if a building is constructed that way, as long as the lowest floor is 2 feet above the base flood elevation, all of the openings meet the venting requirements, then that type of development could be allowed. If you had a basement, if it was pre-firm or built before the flood insurance rate maps were published, then it would be pre-existing non-conforming, and unless they were to hit a substantial improvement threshold, they wouldn't be a violation of the program. If, however, it was newer construction, it was built after the maps were published, and it was built in one of those areas that's identified on the map, then the basement would be a violation, and it would have to be filled to bring it into compliance. So that would be the mitigation that would be required there. Obviously not something anybody wants to go through, not an easy conversation to have with a homeowner, or for us, it's not an easy conversation to have with the communities. So if at all possible, we like to avoid this situation in the first place.
Hey, Brad, sorry to interrupt. This is Chris. I just wanted, you seem to be fading just a little bit, and we had a question, we had a comment from one of the attendees that she's having she was having a little trouble hearing you. I can hear you okay, but I think your volume has dropped a little bit. So if you can turn it up a bit, that would be great.
Sure. I'll
Thanks.
try to just hold this mic closer to my face here.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let me know if it's too loud.
Not yet. That was good. Not too loud. Thanks, Brad.
Yep, no
That's
problem. And
good stuff. We're really glad to have you on.
Thanks, and hopefully that was all the information came through. So I apologize to anybody that couldn't hear or was having trouble hearing. Moving on to these types of foundations where we have columns, piers, piles. This is what we're going to see more often in coastal high hazard areas, coastal A areas, and depending on the type of soil characteristics, is going to kind of determine what type of foundation you could have here. Piles are going to protect more in areas where you have weak soils, and this allows for a little bit of more scour and erosion to take place without compromising the structural integrity. But if you're in a coastal high hazard area, but not necessarily in one of those zones where that type of foundation is warranted, then maybe just columns or pier foundation might be sufficient. So that's going to be something that's case by case, site basis. That's how that's determined. So all of these types of, all of this would be considered compliant with the program. Now the freeboard we've mentioned a couple times. It's that extra margin of safety. New York applies a 2-foot freeboard across the board for any development in the flood hazard area. If you have older maps, then you likely also have an older local law for flood damage prevention that may not necessarily include the freeboard requirements. And when you get new maps, our office, likely myself, will reach out to you with a model local law that will include all the changes that have happened since that time. We keep a model local law up to date. I'll send that as a template that you can use to update your regulations. That would include the 2-foot of freeboard. If that's not the case and you have the older regulation, the older maps, the uniform code has still been updated since that time. So as long as you are enforcing to the minimum requirements of the flood provisions in the uniform code, then you should be in compliance with New York State standards and also the NFIP standards, because the uniform code is actually above and beyond it for this, for elevation requirements, and in a couple other areas as well. So as I mentioned before, hopefully you could hear me at that time, this could lower your flood insurance rates. It's a less clear relationship now since the risk rating 2.0 was moved forward, but it still makes sense to elevate higher where you can, where it's possible. Most studies show that, I should say all studies show that the return that you're going to receive in terms of how much it's going to cost to elevate versus the damages that you're not going to incur, or that the benefit cost ratio is there to justify elevating a little bit higher where you can. And for the coastal areas, so this is an example, looks like a crawl space with flood venting openings here. In the previous slide, we showed the columns, piers, posts, and piles. Those in those areas where you're using that type of foundation because you're in the coastal high hazard area, the reference is instead of the top of the lowest floor, which is shown on this slide, is actually going to be the lowest horizontal structural member of that foundation. So that's just something to keep in mind if you do work in a community that has coastal high hazard areas, and that would be for mostly Long Island and the Great Lakes is the only areas in New York that have B zones that I'm aware of. So obviously we want to limit development in the floodplain. keeping development out of these areas in the first place is it's not really even an argument of whether or not that is a more effective strategy than, if the program allows for developing in the flood hazard area, but you're taking on some risk, some level of risk if you allow development in those areas. It is acknowledged that it's an acceptable level of risk to take on, provided that development moves forward, meets the minimum standards, but you're never going to minimize the risk as much as just avoiding these areas in the first place. And that's going to allow not only for the reduced risk to residents in the community, but also all of the other beneficial functions you're going to get from having natural floodplains. And while the NFIP or National Flood Insurance Program is really focused on keeping development safe, it's not really as focused on the natural functions and benefits from floodplain. You're still going to receive all those benefits.
Hey, Brad, I think Andy is going to take the next batch of slides, but even before we do that, Monica, do you want to pause for a minute and take a couple questions and see what Brad has to say about a couple questions that have come up?
Sure. Well, somebody was looking for examples of updated FEMA maps that include the base flood elevation numbers. So I was actually just looking for something, but they were just looking for an example so we get a sense of what the new maps look like. So that's not necessarily something that we need to talk about right now, but there was a question about how variances would work, and I did suggest that we will have our slides on variances. So a couple of these questions, I guess we could wait and see, because maybe the topic will get covered, but the question was, if the planning board denies a building permit to build in a high-risk flood area and the person appeals to the ZBA, can we on the ZBA refer to the NFIP as a reason to deny the appeal? To which I explained that there was local floodplain regulations versus the building code, and the person referenced a building permit. So I thought maybe we'd wait and see if, when you're doing those slides, when they come up, if we just keep that question in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Monica, because we will get to those shortly, actually, and I'm going to present them, and then I'm going to double check with Brad to see if he agrees. So we'll get to that.
We're good right now.
Okay, sounds good. Because yeah, I've seen some go through, and I just wanted to see what you were thinking. But why don't we hear from Andy? We'll give you a little break, Brad. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brad, and thanks everyone again for being in attendance this evening. We're going to go ahead and move forward to the discuss natural floodplains a little bit here. And as the slide indicates, floodplains work like a sponge. Naturally.
Actually, you need to get control of the screen from Brad. Brad, you've got to pass control of the screen to Andy if you can. Sorry, I should have mentioned that a minute ago. There we go.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Does everyone see the natural floodplain slide now?
Yes.
All right. Good deal. So as I was saying, natural floodplains work like a sponge. They slow the flow of the water. Wetlands close to the headwaters of streams and rivers can slow down rainwater, runoff, snow melt, and especially if they're vegetated, because plants can slow the water down and absorb the energy. This helps prevent sudden damaging floods downstream. So obviously, you can see the picture here. A lot of that water, has flowed into this what might be, look like an open field when it's potentially not, flooded. Very important to limit development in such areas, as the previous slide indicated. They also act as storage reservoirs. Floodplains, they're naturally storage reservoirs, and this allows excess water to spread out over large surfaces, thus reducing the flow. And this is why it's important to preserve natural habitats like this, because it's nature's way, really, of controlling floods. By draining floodplains, developing in them, there's less natural surface for the water to spread out, and that will increase water velocity, also increasing potential damage downstream. So some benefits of undeveloped floodplains, and this is the picture Chris alluded to back in the beginning of Walton, where you saw that large flooded main street. And having worked in Delaware County previously, in a previous career, this river does not look like it does in this picture anymore. This is meandering, and it's kind of how it naturally existed. And because they altered it, it's caused some serious problems in that area. Although they did do some extensive work and some grants to the state recently. So, but anyway, that's what Chris was referencing. So you can take a close look at that. Pretty interesting. But yeah, benefits of undeveloped floodplains. Obviously we alluded to. It's going to reduce damage, and it's going to, allow plants and animals to have their natural habitat. But these floodplains are lowland areas adjacent to lakes, waterways, wetlands, rivers, typically covered by water during floods. And the most visible function of a floodplain is its ability to carry and store these floodwaters. So undeveloped floodplains also provide many other natural and economic resource benefits. Floodplains contain wetlands and other areas that are important to a diverse and healthy ecosystem. Such recreational activities as hunting, fishing, recreational trails, etc. So it's important to consider, these floodplains in undeveloped areas when making land use decisions within your community. And apologies if you hear my son screaming across the hall, but I think it's been mitigated at this point. But
I hope it's okay. I did just hear a tiny bit of it. And I
okay.
That must be coming from your house. I hope it's not distracting you too much. And yeah, so somebody asked earlier, we had a dog last week, then a cat at the beginning of this presentation, and of course, a little boy.
He's in the bath, so he's having fun at least.
Good.
The joys of working from home, right? Anyway, as we move along, we have a model floodplain zoning law, which Brad and his cohorts at DEC are experts in this. But yes, they provide many model languages for local flood damage protection laws. This model language describes the minimum requirements for a community to participate in the NFIP, and communities can, however, adopt more protective standards. And DEC also provides some of those additional languages for communities that so desire to do that. Also, New York State Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code, referred to as Uniform Code, requires building design includes 2 feet of freeboard above the base flood elevation, which Brad was discussing a few slides back, which is actually higher than the national level, I believe Brad mentioned. So no adverse impact principle. Some folks, if you've been on boards, may have heard this in the past, but it's a principle that aims to prevent the actions of any community or property owner from impeding on the rights of others, and all while reducing flood loss as well. So anything built in a flood area shouldn't make it worse, essentially, anywhere else, and or minimizing those impacts. Drainage systems stormwater plans, swales, et cetera, are examples as to some of those mitigation ideas. So yeah, as a board member, you got to understand that you have a role in this, and you should consider the cumulative impacts of current and future development when you're reviewing projects.
Andy, you sound
yeah.
good, but can you speak up just a little bit too?
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks.
Let's move my mic around here a little bit. Is this any better?
Yeah, that's a little better.
Right,
one of the attendees was saying that it was your volume was fluctuating, and then I noticed it too.
Gotcha.
Thanks.
Okay. I will hold this a little closer here. So yeah, when you're reviewing as a board member, reviewing projects, it's always a great idea to ensure that your actions that are taken in the floodplains and throughout the watershed don't lead to adverse impacts and on people's property and their rights as a property owner. So these can change, obviously, based on physical environments, social and economic conditions. But yeah, that pretty much sums up no adverse impact principles. So we'll move along to the next one here. Overlay zones. Basically, overlay zones superimpose an additional set of regulations over an existing zoning district, or it could be multiple districts. Oftentimes, these overlay zones fill a gap where traditional zoning may have not addressed it originally or specifically, or it could have been complicated local conditions or multiple jurisdiction issues, things of that nature. So for example, floodplain overlay, some communities refer to it as a floodplain overlay, can put an overlay in place along a river. So essentially it goes over that river, X amount of feet determined by, the regulations. And this so that river might flow through several different zones and districts, but protecting land along an entire river with one set of rules that applies across all those districts. So you mentioned the multi-jurisdictional issues. That's one way to work around that. So some of the common set of standards you can see here in the slide: base layers, sets, are permitted uses and dimensions. This can include restrictions, landscaping requirements, standards for environmentally sensitive areas, and landscaping requirements always a great thing to consider. There's different vegetation and plants that could be used to help mitigate some impacts, et cetera. And let's see. So I think we're going to go back to Chris, correct?
Yes, thanks, Andy.
Chris, we did have a couple of questions in that stretch. Could we just quickly do those?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
sounds
Brad,
good.
Brad, I think one of them or both of them will most likely be for you.
Sure. That somehow doesn't surprise me.
Right, exactly. So the first question was, given the situation after the Hurricane Helene in North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, do you foresee changes in New York law concerning flood mitigation? That's the first question. There's two different ones. So any thoughts are we considering here in New York State any additions to our regulations, which obviously are already more stringent than the national program, but anything being talked about that might be on the horizon?
Yes. Yep. And it's not just New York State. I would say our last national conference, there's a lot of discussion of the regulatory level that was selected, I'll say, at the beginning of the program was kind of a compromise. And I don't want to get too much. This is a larger topic that would take a lot longer to get into, but basically the 100-year floodplain is not you'll have in any given area, you'll have areas where the flooding levels were higher, historic floods were more damaging than what we're actually regulating to. And the question is, how much risk are we willing to accept? Because you have to have a balance between what you're restricting, the development that you're restricting, whether or not you're restricting based on historic floods or if you're looking into the future. These are conversations that are kind of always taking place, and there's a number of different proposals on how this might, how we could take a different view on this. And so to simply answer the question, yes, those conversations are taking place. Yes, they're taking place in New York. They're also taking place in I'll say most other states in the country, not all, but certainly it's worth considering. And Andy mentioned the optional additional language. We do provide, when we send out a local law, those model laws, there's language that would allow a community to go. So New York already goes above and beyond the minimum standards of the NFIP, but there's nothing that prevents a local community from even going above and beyond those codes, standards, requirements. And we have some of the more typical ones that we see is the language that we provide. So just as an example, I briefly mentioned the substantial improvement requirement, which means if you have construction, you have you're altering a building, say you're putting on an addition or you're doing some other work, if the work meets or exceeds 50% of the value of the structure before the improvements took place, that would meet this threshold called substantial improvement. Also applies for substantial damage. So if a building suffers damage from a flood, if that damage was the cost to repair that damage was more than 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage took place, it would meet substantial damage requirements, which would mean bringing it up into compliance with the current code. And going back to some of the foundation designs, that would mean those structures, a structure with a basement would have to be filled at that time. Some of the optional additional language allows for, so people, builders, engineers, and people that applicants are hiring are well aware of this requirement and are very good at getting around it. So they will typically put in a project, put in the permit, and keep it under that 50% threshold, and then at a later time do a future project and then continue on that way. And then they could basically redo the entire structure without ever hitting that 50% threshold. If a community saw this happening a lot, you could get around that by adopting a cumulative substantial improvement clause, which says if you improve the structure by more than 50% over the course of, let's say, the last 10 years, then you're going to hit this requirement. Similar to that for substantial damage, you could say if you suffer damage of 50% over the course of 10 years, then you'd have to meet this requirement. You'd have to meet the current code. And because the current code is more results in structures and development that's more resilient to future flood damages, that's a way to bring some of the existing building stock into a more resilient place. So I don't want to get off. I probably did get off topic too much, but let me know if anyone has any other questions on that or if we want to move on.
That's great, Brad. And I'm just on that topic. I wanted to ask the question, do you know of any municipalities that have gone really above and beyond? Like you send them the model language and then optional add-ons. Do you know of any municipalities that have gone even above that? Like are there any in the state that really stand out to you?
Yes. there are. There's Town of Greece. Is anyone on from Town of Greece? They adopted additional maps. So they don't just regulate to what FEMA publishes, but they also have historic maps. And again, those historic maps might show flooding that the boundary of which extends out further than what's shown on our flood insurance rate maps or FEMA's flood insurance rate maps. And they regulate to both of those maps. So whichever is greater. So if the flood insurance rate map happens to extend out a little bit further from the flooding source, then they base their review on that. If the historic maps extend out further, they use those. And then Freeport, I believe it's Freeport, adopted a 4-foot freeboard. So if you are a community, you're subject to, you have coastal high hazard areas, you're subject to that type of flooding risk, maybe you would like, maybe 2 feet isn't enough. And so it's within a community's power to up the freeboard, extend out the maps. You could have, if there's other flooding information, so best available information is what communities can use to not limit themselves to just regulating what's in the SFHA or Special Flood Hazard Area.
Thanks. And thanks for catching yourself with that acronym and spelling it out. So Monica, I think there's another one, right?
Yep, there was one other
before
one.
We move on?
Is there any research into the possible effects of extensive subsurface drainage systems in ag lands? Couldn't characterize that more, but that's essentially the question that was asked. I don't know if anybody.
So if I understand the question, I don't think I have the answer. So there might be that I'm not aware of. It sounds like a stormwater question or local drainage or pluvial flooding question, which is a great question and a great topic. We have the time. I take the opportunity to point out that the other limitation of the flood insurance rate maps is they're mapping riverine and coastal flooding and not necessarily localized flooding from if you have a community with the stormwater drainage systems are maybe undersized or for whatever reason are just contributing to localized flooding. That's not necessarily going to show up on a flood insurance rate map. So that's another great example of an area where a community could have a study done that shows areas that flood that maybe aren't represented on the regulatory products and say, we would also like to apply these building development standards in these areas as well because we know that these areas flood. So I apologize. I don't think I really answered the question, but I'm not sure if there's been an extensive study on I don't even remember the way that you phrased it, Monica.
That's okay, Brad. We always say if people are successful in stumping us right on the stand here, right on the spot, we have the ability in the days following webinars or in-person events to do a little research for them. So maybe we can try to do that. We can talk to our speaker from last week, Jeff Kehoe, who helped us with farmland protection and ag viability, and see if he has any thoughts. So why don't we, what was that?
Just real quick, I will say,
yeah, sure.
I just thought of it while you were speaking. The HEC-RAS is a modeling that's used in most of these studies. And I was just on a webinar last week or the week before where they were discussing the improvements to the software that allow for better modeling of subsurface drainage. So right as it is now, it's not, unless you had somebody that's using other software that's not really an industry standard, it's likely that that's not really being incorporated or included in the modeling. So, but it sounds like, and I'm not an engineer, I don't use the software other than to check models. But my understanding is that modelers in the future will have that more readily available for them to use and incorporate into their flood studies.
Well, thanks again, Brad. And I'm going to give a few slides. I'm going to do a few slides here, which are all the better because I spoke to Brad about them before, a little earlier today before we logged on for the webinar. And Brad, just jump in and add anything if you need to. But I have a few slides here, and then we're going to go back to Brad for a few. He's kind of loaded up at the end here. So variances, as Monica mentioned, well, first off, it's hard to imagine a situation that would create a hardship sufficient to justify a variance from the flood elevation requirement. The requirement itself is designed to prevent hardships. The reason we have these regulations is to prevent damage to property, loss of life, loss of, and especially repeated damage. And we'll talk later on about places that have been damaged repeatedly in flood events. So as Monica said, there are two types of variances, and they obviously should be rare. We say this in Zoning Board of Appeals overview when we talk about zoning variances given by the Zoning Board of Appeals, use and area variances. But the types of variances to flood insurance to flood regulations include those that are written into local regulations that would be by the local Board of Appeals, and those that touch on the regulations of the Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code. Those are granted by, and I just made this correction in everybody's handout, this says the Codes Council, but it's New York State Regional Boards of Review. It's the regional board, the Codes Regional Boards of Review that grant variances from the Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code. And Brad gave a good example earlier when we talked informally about this. If the relief sought violates both sets of regulations or is needed from both, is argued to be needed from both sets of regulations, variances relief must be granted by both the local Board of Appeals and the Regional Board of Review. And if Brad and his colleagues and others, it can be, as Brad explained to me, the FEMA representatives, the Federal Emergency Management Agency representatives, if you're granting too many variances or there are too many violations, your local program might be in jeopardy. Your enrollment, your standing with the National Flood Insurance Program, and your ability as a local government to offer the subsidized flood insurance might be jeopardized if relief is granted too frequently and if enforcement is too lax. So an example of a situation that might result in two variances would be, Brad talked a lot about freeboard. There's base flood elevation, the 1% chance of flooding, and then the 2 feet above that that's required in New York State. Well, if somebody wanted only 1 foot above base flood elevation to elevate a structure, for example, then the relief would be granted by just the Regional Board of Review, because is that correct, Brad? Or would both? I guess no. It would be the Regional Board of Review. If it were lower than base flood elevation, then relief would have to be granted by both the local zoning Board of Appeals, because it's less than the national program, and by the Regional Board of Review. And now I just thought, even if it were 1 foot below, it's New York standard, and your model law is at least New York standard. So even just the 1 foot below freeboard, the 2 foot freeboard would need relief from both the local board and the regional board of review.
Right. So
okay.
The distinction here is whether the local law has been passed more recently or not. So any community with paper maps likely still has an older law. Their flood damage prevention local law likely doesn't have freeboard requirement in it. So
oh,
in that case, then they would only need a variance from state requirements.
I see. Okay.
And just from our discussion, if we're working with a community and they have an identified violation, and it's obviously mitigating to the full extent practicable is going to mean meeting state requirements, but there is some acknowledgement, at least from FEMA, that as long as you're meeting NFIP minimum standards and being in between the two, between NFIP standards and state standards, is a little bit different than if you're below even the NFIP minimum standards.
Okay, I've got it. Thank you. So I just take for granted that everybody's got the latest version of the model regulations, and I really shouldn't do that, because your model regulations are consistent with the Uniform Code of New York State. So the model law that you're sending out now includes that 2 feet of freeboard, at least.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
About half the state probably is in that situation where their local law and Uniform Code are going to line up. They're both going to require 2 feet of freeboard, and then I'll say roughly half for now, maybe a little less than half right now, and that number should go down pretty quickly in the near future with new mapping products coming out and new laws being adopted. But as of right now, that's kind of where people are. Depends on what community.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, that's an easy stat to remember. Thank you. So the criteria for granting some relief, it's in the FEMA regulations, is showing cause, and that failure to receive the relief would result in exceptional hardship, and that the relief, if granted, would not result in increased flood heights, in increased flood potential for areas around it, and cause problems for neighbors and others nearby, and that the variance, and this is consistent with all of our lessons about granting relief in the form of variances, that it's the minimum necessary to provide relief. And often we see examples, and we'll direct your attention to the photo here, and it's for water-related, water-dependent uses that are those that receive variances most frequently and appropriately. So and this is very general for those who are unfamiliar with the process of variances from the Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code, there is a means of granting of relief from the code, and it's done by the codes division. It's the state, it's a state law, so the state has regional boards of review that meet quarterly, and they provide relief when there are, it's kind of similar, somewhat similar to zoning variances, when there are practical difficulties or hardship that would be relieved if there were some flexibility granted. And if the code actually creates an excessive or unreasonable burden that can be mitigated by this relief. And it should not substantially affect provisions for health, safety, and welfare, and it would not result in an adverse impact to the code's intended objective. A variance can be granted if it does not inhibit the advancement of some other important public policy. And a lot of the time this is development it might be infill development in areas that have some, as Brad talked about it, measured risk for flooding. You can't eliminate all risk, but in an area where there's available property to develop in maybe a downtown or a neighborhood that's substantially developed, and there's a proposal for housing, and there's a demonstrated need all across the state for housing. So infill housing in an area where there is some flood risk and it's infeasible to meet the code, meet the letter of the code, there are means to provide that relief. And that another criterion is that it would be physically or legally impracticable to comply with the code, that it would be unnecessary in light of alternatives that advance the code's intended objective, and that would that the relief, if granted, would entail a change so slight to produce negligible additional benefit if it were not to be granted. So this is language out of the regulations allowing for relief from the Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code. So there are instances where, although they're fairly rare, there are many criterion that have to be satisfied in order to grant that relief, and again, it's by the Regional Board of Review. This is an example of an elevation of a historic structure. It's in a local and National Register historic district in the village of Owego in the southern tier in Tioga County, where there was extensive damage from flooding of the Susquehanna River in 2011 from Hurricane Lee. And this was a real success story in this particular case. It took years to achieve this level of success, and I had the good fortune of hearing the owners of this house speak at a conference a couple of years ago about their experience. They were flooded out, and the house is a few blocks from the river actually, but it's in a low-lying area. And so it flooded pretty badly. They cleaned out, and they moved out for I think several months, maybe even close to a year, and then they moved back in before they were able to get their funding for elevating the structure. And their full presentation had lots of photos and lots of detail, but the outcome was they moved out again, and the structure was elevated and improved. They had to make substantial investment themselves, and there was investment by FEMA, but the result was an elevated structure that doesn't really look elevated because the landscaping around it is all incorporated, and it was really successful. Not every elevation of a historic structure is, and if you have a situation like this or know of situations like this in your communities, the first place to call, I think, would be the State Historic Preservation Office to see what is available at this point for funding for elevating structures. And I'm just going to say here that if you have properties in National Register districts, or they're individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or they're parts of their local landmarks or in local historic districts, the changes to make them more resilient and comply with the resiliency goals shouldn't destroy or alter the character that makes them contributing to these distinctions. And so the working with the State Historic Preservation Office, your rep at the State Historic Preservation Office, and if you have local historic district regulations, I think there's a general understanding by both bodies, both the state and local boards, that there is some degree of compromise in making more resilient our historic structures. We don't want them destroyed entirely, and so some compromise has to be accepted in preparing them, making them more resilient, preparing them for more intensive storms, certainly if they happen to be in harm's way. So I am going to turn control of the screen back to Brad, who's going to talk to us a little bit about new development, which he touched upon a little earlier in flood zones.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I'm going to go through these slides a little bit quicker just because this is a little bit of repeat information that I covered in the beginning here. So, when we are looking at development, especially for the National Flood Insurance Program, there's a distinction between residential and non-residential buildings. So for residential structures, we're looking at elevation. That's pretty much the only means to achieve compliance with the requirements. And elevation means determining what the base flood elevation is and then elevating the top of the lowest floor to that level plus 2 feet. Basements are not allowed in the flood hazard area, and the definition for the Code of Federal Regulations, which is where National Flood Insurance Program regulations are found, is a little bit different than the definition from Uniform Code. And that is pretty simply a basement is a foundation that's below grade on all sides. So if you had a walkout basement and one full side is not below grade, then that wouldn't meet that requirement and could be allowed. You'd want to limit what that space underneath the base flood elevation is used for still, so you wouldn't want to see people putting in, say they have a walkout basement, we still wouldn't want to see them putting in a bedroom down there. You want to limit that access, limit the use to storage, access, or parking. So elevating structures above garages is a great way to elevate. Chris talked about that historic structure being, aesthetically still kind of blending in and looking like it was supposed to be that way. It was supposed to be elevated like that in the first place, which we know isn't the case. That's not how it was originally constructed. But so building on top of garages is something that we see in a lot of areas, especially where you need a significant amount of elevation to get above that base flood elevation. In any of those enclosed spaces underneath that area, underneath that elevation, a base flood elevation, we want to see flood-resistant materials and proper venting as well. And that, again, is to allow for the water to come in and out of the building automatically. If you had a basement, you would have to pump the water out, and that is not automatic by definition. Now, the three forces, we don't cover them too much in this presentation, but the three forces we're looking at when we're talking about flooding is buoyancy, hydrostatic force, and hydrodynamic force. And pretty simply, that's flotation, buoyancy. Hydrostatic is the pressure of the water pushing in on the foundation, and that's why we have to protect for collapse. And that's another reason we have the venting, to allow the water to come in and out and that equalizes the pressure and actually protects the foundation, the structural integrity of the foundation. It doesn't protect the materials, it doesn't protect any contents that might be in that enclosed space, but it protects the foundation itself. And then we want to see anchoring to protect against any lateral movement, to protect against that hydrodynamic force, the water actually pushing against things as it moves through the area. For non-residential structures, all of the same requirements apply, except that non-residential structures can be allowed to dry flood-proof their way into compliance. The same elevation requirements apply. You still have to, if you are going to dry flood-proof something, which means you're going to protect it, you're going to seal the building envelope and not allow any water, or at least not a minimal amount of seepage into it. There's different rates that are allowed. You could have, it doesn't have to be completely impermeable, but the idea is you're keeping the water out. And with that comes the risk of that hydrostatic pressure building up. The deeper the water is, the more pressure it's going to push against the walls and could potentially compromise the integrity of the entire foundation. So all of that needs to be reviewed by a registered design professional. It's usually a licensed professional engineer, and signed off and stamped that that structure will still will not collapse under those loads. And but in that way, they can dry flood proof and protect the building without having to elevate out of the flood hazard area. The idea here is, of course, that we don't have or shouldn't have people sleeping in non-residential structures. Typically looking at a lower risk to life, safety, human health. So that's part of the reason that dry flood proofing is allowed for non-residential versus residential. Hazardous materials. We talked about the floodway and that area being subject to higher velocities. It's a higher risk area. It has additional regulatory requirements, and that includes prohibiting any hazardous materials and the manufacture of any hazardous materials from those areas. And when we talk about high hazard areas, we're also talking about coastal high hazard areas, which are V zones or VE zones. So similar to floodways, we don't want to see hazardous materials in those zones. There isn't really, in at least the regulations, doesn't prohibit hazardous materials in the flood fringe, although we would highly recommend avoiding that wherever possible. Subdivision requirements. So this used to be a little bit more, there was more of a distinction before some of the recent code updates for subdivision, because prior to the 2020 code, if you had development in a zone, an area of approximate flood hazard without a base flood elevation available on the map, and if you didn't have from another source a best available data of it, something you could readily use for that development, if it was, say, a single structure, you could allow that to be developed and elevated to 3 feet above the highest adjacent grade. We talked about lowest adjacent grade. That's where the structure touches the ground and the lowest part. Highest adjacent grade is if you look at the site before it's developed, before it's leveled and all of that, the highest point of where that development footprint is going to be would be your highest adjacent grade. And it used to be that you could literally just measure with a yardstick 3 feet above that, and that was your elevation in areas where you didn't have a published base flood elevation. In subdivisions, and for the purposes of the National Flood Insurance Program, that's any subdivision of 50 units or over 5 acres. So over 50 units, over 5 acres would hit that threshold. You'd have to have a base flood elevation developed. I say you, the applicant would have to hire an engineer to develop that base flood elevation, to use it to be able to determine what the elevation should be. Since the 2020 building code, uniform code, residential code, that elevation of 3 feet above highest adjacent grade is no longer allowed. And even a residential structure in an approximate zone has to have a base flood elevation determined. So that distinction between the two is not quite as it's not as quite as different anymore, because essentially now any area that you're developing, if it doesn't have a base flood elevation, you either have to obtain one from a reputable source, which could be it could be a FEMA study, there could be a different individual study. For whatever reason, if the area had been studied for some other work that was taking place, that might be something that you could use. Our office we have access to some elevations that aren't in the published products that we can provide. So we always recommend to reach out to our office first, and if we don't have it, we can try to see if it's available from another place and provide it. But if we can't and it's not available, then it would have to be developed for that site. But the subdivisions themselves should be held to higher standards because you're going to have more residential properties in this area. So when you're considering these types of plans, you want to do as much as possible to minimize the damage that you're likely to incur at some point if a portion of that subdivision is located in a special flood hazard area. There's a lot of creative ways. I'm sure the attendees on here, on planning boards or planners yourselves, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that there's plenty of ways that you can reduce the risk and probably even make the development more desirable for people that are going to be moving there. And that might include more green space. It might include strategically placing development in a way that the structures themselves are located on a higher ground, so forth. But if we're set on developing that area and there's no alternative area to develop, you just want to make sure that everything is, that you're minimizing that risk to being flooded. So you've acknowledging that there's a flood-prone area, but you're moving forward and developing in a way, because again, and to step back, the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, does not prohibit development in the floodplain anywhere. It just requires that community commit to enforcing regulations that protect and minimize the damage in those areas. So the same concept, the same thought process applies for subdivisions, just with some additional considerations that should kind of be taking place. And might be something that not a floodplain administrator alone can review and look at, and they might need that support from the planning board or the zoning board. And I think we talked about the base flood elevation data requirement here. We want to see adequate drainage, obviously. So for subdivision tips, I'm just going to double check. I'm still on my slide. I've got that on there.
I think we're moving to Andy here. Andy's going to do a couple, and then Brad, in the interest of time, I'm guilty too. With all your knowledge, we've really taken a lot of time on this first batch of slides. I think we're going to go to Andy. He's going to do a few slides quickly, and then maybe you can go through the mapping slides and then just speak very briefly on the floodplain administrator's duties, and then we'll wrap up and so that we have some time for discussion. And when you come back on, we've had a couple comments from people who are still having trouble hearing you. So remember to speak up when you come back on. But let's go to Andy, and Brad, if you can give Andy control of the screen, that would be great. Thank you for that really valuable information. Andy, you're up. Is Andy there? There he is.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, gentlemen. I hit the button one too many times. At any rate, for those folks in attendance tonight that review subdivisions with their boards, not every community has subdivision regulations. Some very helpful tips on the screen here. Number one, don't approve lots that don't conform with floodplain regulations. If you're going to remember any of the tips, that's probably the one you want to remember. Identifying waterways, wetlands, and examining them early in the process is also very important. Show the floodplain boundary elevations on the preliminary plans. Again, those preliminary plans, it's the beginning of the conversation, the beginning of the review. You definitely want to, include those on the plats. There's certain ways to get around that with design standards as well. You can include those as useful tools. Require watercourse drainage way traversing subdivisions to have dedicated public easements for maintenance. I know I've worked in a community here in the Capital District that did exactly that. It's very beneficial for the community. Require public drainage installations and improvements, and tie in soil erosion sediment control regulations into your plans. So some helpful do's and don'ts for site plan review. When conducting site plan review through the lens of a floodplain management, you're going to want to keep these things in consideration. Do preserve natural vegetation buffers, locate new streets outside 100-year floodplains, and ensure adequate stormwater and drainage facilities are there in their maintenance. General dues, it's not on the list here, but use a checklist, very important. It's a great tool for applicants so they know exactly what they need to, it's required of them for the process, and it's great for their boards because it ensures they haven't overlooked anything in their process. And board members, you want to weigh your applications, evaluate them, for these, for safety, flood risks, and drainage and other aspects in order to protect the public, the adjacent parcels and infrastructure that may be nearby. Some don'ts. Don't disturb sensitive resource areas, as we discussed before. The best way to preserve floodplains is by not building in it. Locate structures 100-year floodplain unless they comply with flood damage prevention local laws. And again, spell all these things out in your application as far as any additional standards. It goes a long way to help the process. Wetland regulations in addition to state and federal permits. One of the best ways for local governments to enhance their wetland protection is by adopting local wetland ordinances. Local governments are often the best suited to fill the wetland protection gaps that may be in their zoning because they're better situated to recognize the wetland values and the needs of their community. So standalone regulations is one way to do that, or a component. You could wrap it into larger programs like a water quality protection program, shoreline management, any stormwater protections, etc. Some things to point out here: the Association of State Wetland Managers model. They have a few different models. I was actually on there today researching some things for this, and it's a very informative site, and that's listed there in the box. And so I think we're going to pass it back over to Brad and discuss some mapping.
Yes. All right. And we're going to go through these very quickly in the interest of time, but we've already covered a lot of this information already. So even if we kind of go quickly through these slides, we've covered the material at some point through this presentation. And if anyone has trouble hearing me, I've done everything that I can to turn my volume and my microphone to the highest I can, and it's I'm practically yelling in my room here. If you have the ability to turn up your speakers, please do that while I'm going through these slides. So there are a lot of different types of maps, and I talked about this earlier. You want to make sure that you are in fact using the flood insurance rate maps. Those are your regulatory maps, and they're different from a wetland layer that you might turn on and off on your county software, or if you have wetland maps up on the wall. We see that a lot when we visit with communities, and we ask them about floodplains, and they point and say, yeah, we have our map is right there, and they point to a wetland map. Well, that's not what we're talking about, so it's very important, and it happens more often than you would think. Flood insurance rate maps should look something similar to this. You'll have the different zones, you'll have the different elevations, and depending on when they were issued, you're going to have a different presentation, but it's the same information. It's this zone, it's information about the zone, what zone it is, what elevation we would expect the water to reach in that zone, and it changes as you can see on this slide. Maybe you can see on this slide as you are going downstream or upstream, the elevations are constantly changing. So when you're reviewing development, it's critical to determine what the base flood elevation is for that specific site, and it could change from house to house. If you are a local floodplain administrator, if you're designated as having that responsibility in your local law for flood damage prevention, then this next section is going to be for you. So this is typically identified as the code enforcement officer or the building inspector. Could also be somebody from the engineering. If you have engineering staff, could be somebody from that department. Could be somebody on the planning board, zoning board. Could be the chief elected official. Could be the clerk. We highly recommend that it be somebody that is familiar with floodplain development, that has some experience with uniform code, because a lot of the requirements for the program are contained within those codes. Also, in the event of a disaster or a very significant flood event, if you've designated the chief elected official, you're presumably going to have a lot to deal with outside of just floodplain management issues. So as far in the post-disaster situation and realm, it's really beneficial to have somebody that can focus on floodplain development and the program, and not have other distractions that they're also responsible for. So what are you responsible for in the first place? So first things first is really just reviewing any development that takes place in the flood hazard area and determining as best you can whether or not it actually is in or out of the special flood hazard area. Because I say that because you'll have many residents will reach out to us. They will say that their lender has identified that they're in a flood hazard area, and a lot of times they're not. We don't have insight in the way that lenders are identifying this, and it's also in their best interest to be a little conservative with their identifications. They might be using a simple parcel layer. They might say, well, the property boundary is within the flood hazard area, so they send that letter and say, you have to get flood insurance. Well, we know that if the building footprint itself isn't within that area, then that resident isn't at risk, at least for the program. They might still be at flood risk, but as far as applying the regulations, they might be naturally elevated outside of the flood hazard area. So first step is just knowing where your maps are, reviewing those maps, and determining whether you need to even move forward with evaluating the structure for flood damage prevention. If you've been in the position for a little while, you're going to be more and more comfortable with providing base flood elevation. If you're new to the program, I encourage you to reach out to our office to assist with that process, or work with if you do have an engineering department, to work with them, or if you work with the county. If the county is doing building code, they might be more familiar with that process. But you need to be reviewing the plans, and you need to be determining whether or not you have to issue a permit in the first place. If you're in a community where you don't have flood insurance rate maps, you should be requiring a building permit for any development to give you an opportunity to do that determination. Most communities have flood insurance rate maps. They have flood hazards identified, and it's just a matter of checking whether something is in or out. And then after you inspect the development moves forward. You need to keep records of all of that. At any given time, the community may have a community assistance visit, which is an audit or an opportunity for someone from our office or FEMA staff to visit with the community, talk about the program, check to see whether the program is being administered and enforced correctly. And the only way to really validate and check that is through your record keeping. So any records you're issuing should be maintained in perpetuity. You should keep your maps, even your historic maps. You should not throw those away, because you might have to review development that took place under a previous floodplain administrator or a previous administration, and that development is where we would be evaluating that development to the map that was in effect at the time. And then we would move forward with remedying any violations that we found. And that is going to be the responsibility of the floodplain administrator primarily, with the support of the community. But it is not the state's job, and it's not FEMA's job. We don't have the authority. We don't have the land use jurisdiction to enforce that. So actually remedying violations, that falls to the community. Again, we've talked a lot about base flood elevations and how to interpret the maps. We have entire courses. We have a 2-hour course just to how to interpret these maps. So I don't expect people to just come away from this course with knowing how to read a flood hazard map. Just know that at any time you can reach out to us and we can assist you with that. We can look at individual development and try to help out with that and kind of move forward from there. We want to make sure that the site plans are including, I'm surprised how often the site plans don't include the delineation of a flood hazard area. That should be something that if you're a floodplain administrator, you're putting that back onto the applicant as a responsibility of either themselves or whoever they've hired to put together the plans. The flood maps are published at a county-wide level. You're never going to get the level of detail that you will from an engineer who's looking at a single site. They can use updated topography. They can delineate that line where the boundary is a lot better for, they're just looking at just that one plot. We want to make sure all the other permits that might be needed are obtained before you issue your floodplain development permit. So that means if there's a state permit, maybe there's an Article 15 permit for some stream work that needs to be issued, you do not want to issue your local floodplain development permit before that permit is issued. And vice versa, you don't, and we hear this happening where applicants will go to a floodplain administrator with a permit that they received from DEC and say, I'm good, I have this permit that allows me to do this work. Those are separate permits, and that does not qualify as a floodplain development permit. So your floodplain development permit is going to be issued for any man-made change in the floodplain, and that includes filling, grading, dredging, basically any alteration to unimproved real estate or improved real estate is going to require some level of review to determine its impact on the floodplain. And we'd already talked a lot about substantial damage, substantial improvement. Any watercourse alterations are going to require a notification to not only your adjacent communities, but also FEMA and DEC. There's likely going to need to be a change in the map. There's going to need to be an assurance that the flood carrying capacity is maintained for that altered watercourse, and that the altered portion is maintained in perpetuity. Elevation certificate is something that we encourage all communities to use. It's a requirement for the community rating system, which is a program that rewards communities for going above and beyond. But this is something that any community can use. It captures all the information that you might need to evaluate the different levels of, so everything we've talked about, lowest adjacent grade, highest adjacent grade, the finished floor level, the lowest horizontal structural supporting member, the base flood elevation, the vertical datum, all of that information is going to be contained within and captured in an elevation certificate in a nice, easy to interpret format. What is not on your list, if you're a floodplain administrator, is, say, a lender, I haven't heard of this happening, but if a lender was to try to pass off that responsibility for determining the zones, it's not your job to determine. They can make their own determinations. They can do whatever they want. It's their money that they're lending out. It's our job and floodplain administrators' jobs to verify using regulatory products whether what they've said is actually true. And we're not insurance agents. I mean, maybe somebody on this call is an insurance agent, but I'm not, and most floodplain administrators I know are not. It's not our job to talk to people about what their rate is, and we can give very general, like I have during this training. If you elevate higher, you're likely going to have a lower insurance premium because you're lowering your risk. That's fair. You can relay that information to anybody that asks. But if they say, I'm elevating up 1 foot, how many hundreds, how much is my premium going to go down by? That's not our job. Flood warnings, you are going to see these if you're working with the county emergency management, or if you're on NIAlerts, or you're looking at the National Weather Service, you're going to see different warnings, watches, warnings. They have different meanings. They are issued at different levels and flooding stages for streams that have stream gauges. The one thing I want to point out here is it's a great tool to use when your flooding source for your community has stream gauges, but stream gauges are not available, and the information on them, even some of them, there might be a stream gauge there, but the data is not being relayed to the National Weather Service or to anyone in emergency management at New York or the county. You want to be very careful about if that's your situation, you might not be getting watches. You might not be getting warnings, even if there is a hazard there or a risk of future flooding. So, but where they are available, they're very useful tools, and they should be acted on. If you're receiving a watch and warning, they're similar to tornadoes. The watches and warnings have similar kind of interpretations. And if you're familiar with the stream gauges, there's different levels. They're color-coded for the different levels that the stream is reaching and what each level kind of means in terms of the flood hazard there. But again, I would kind of caution against, you at the local level probably have much more intimate knowledge of your flooding risks certainly than National Weather Service has. Maybe they are relaying that data of what the flood stage, what the stream gauge is telling them, but you should just use that information as a tool to strengthen your own emergency management capabilities. And that would include having your own preparedness plans and identifying who's doing what, at what time, in each different stage, before the flood happens, during the flood, after the flood. And I think I pass it back to Chris.
And I'll just wrap up really quickly here, Brad. Thank you. Acquisition occurs, it does occur for the highest risk. There have been a couple instances of this. In the highest risk, most frequently flooded areas, to restore the natural floodplain and save resources from continued damage to properties. If you can pass the control of the screen back to me, Brad, I'll just whip through these last couple slides. Thank you. So the advantages, this is the natural floodplain here in this photo. The advantages are obvious. I think there was, actually in this one, there was it's not working here, but in our PowerPoint, you could see the different stages. This last photo here was an area that had flooded, it was developed, it was flooded, it was cleared, and the natural floodplain restored here. So in the end, it's expensive at first, but it'll save from, we've seen instances where acquisition of property and the restoration of the natural floodplain has saved money from, it saved resources from future floods. The disadvantages, of course, are obvious. It's expensive and can be very controversial. There is, however, as Brad and his colleagues reminded us recently, money out there for acquisition right now. And so I think, Brad, if you could send us some of that information for local officials, if they're interested in accessing funds for acquisition, and we'll send out that information with the certificates. If you could send us that information, I think the conclusion, we've really been lucky to have Brad on, is to avoid floodplain development, and that the goals of the National Flood Insurance Program is, it's a compromise. It was not to subsidize further development in the floodplain. Rates are going up right now. They're going up gradually, and they attempt to reflect those properties. They attempt to reflect a discount to those properties that existed before the program, but it is becoming more and more expensive to develop in the floodplain. Rates are reflecting that. And we and Brad have great examples of laws that go above and beyond. And I'm glad I asked that question of Brad earlier of real models. So we're just over time, but I do want to take the opportunity, having Brad on, to have Monica read us a few of the questions that have come in. Anyone who has to drop off at this point, they'll still get 2 hours of credit, but anybody who wants to stay on will stay on for a couple minutes and have a little bit of discussion with the questions that have been asked. And I will put on the screen Brad's contact information and ours. So what do we have, Monica?
Yes, so we have a few here. So the first question is, my town is on the Hudson River. Does the Army Corps have input on anything above the mean high water mark? So once you get above that mean high water mark, is Army Corps involved in any reviews, essentially, in that scenario?
Anything above the mean high water mark?
Yes, that's the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that.
Oh, good, because I didn't either, and I thought I should.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. I'm not
I mean,
well,
obviously,
yeah.
if it was a, yeah, I think right. It would depend upon the scenario, but yeah, I wasn't sure either. Okay.
Well, maybe we can take that one and
Yep.
and research it and get back to the questioner.
Okay. And then I did answer this, but just in case people missed the written response, but because I think this is an interesting thing that folks should be aware of. Are realtors and private sellers required by law to inform prospective buyers if they're in a flood hazard zone?
Yes, they are now.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which was I did respond to that, but I think it's important for people to know that. Yep.
Yep. And just slightly adjacent to that topic, I would strongly encourage people to exercise caution when you're using like a Zillow or Realtor.com, something like that. They have now built-in tools to show what your flood risk is, and I don't know, they all have different ways of how they present that information, and none of it seems to be tied to actual flood insurance rate maps. So just put that out there.
Good tip. Okay, another question. Will the new New York flood zone map, so anything that's being developed by FEMA, show areas below dams and man-made aqueducts?
So flood inundation maps are different than the information that's presented in a flood insurance rate map. Most flood insurance rate studies assume free flow conditions unless there was a higher level of detail that was incorporated into the study, which is often not the case. So for any high hazard dams in the state, there should be an emergency action plan that has a flood inundation map associated with it. That the flooding extent that's shown on that map is going to be different than what you're going to see in on your flood insurance rate maps.
Okay.
Hopefully I answered that question.
Yep. Excellent. And then this question, let's see, considering the Supreme Court, and I do think you more or less touched on this, but I'm just going to, so that the person knows that I put this out there, but I think we discussed this a little bit earlier, but considering the Supreme Court's Sackett decision and likely future weakening of regulatory laws pertaining to waters in the U.S., thoughts on if New York State will have adequate state regulatory authority for floodplain protection? To me, I think the question is, will we, ultimately we already go beyond some of what's required anyway at the federal level. So, I guess the question is whether or not there will be state regulatory authority, which I do think we have because we've already done some things. But any future thoughts on that?
No, I think you covered it. It's included in our regulations. New York State models the code after the international code, but it also adds on to that additional New York State codes. And I can't answer obviously for them, but I anticipate that would not change. That's a question more for the Code Council when it comes to uniform code. But the Federal Flood Risk Management, FFRMS, was recently passed or implemented into law too, and that requires federal agencies, at least FEMA, to develop to certain standards, most of which are higher regulatory standards than even the NFIP and even some of the local flood requirements. So that just recently passed. I don't expect that to change either. That includes a lot of looking at future flood risk and looking at incorporating future flood risk into those types of projects, anything that's either a federal project or anything that's receiving federal funding.
And I think the DEC's, well, the change in wetland regulations,
Yes, exactly.
that we're hearing quite a bit about, and we haven't featured in our webinars because the DEC is doing this. That was a response to that decision, to
Yes.
that it really has to be clarified by state and local governments, that level of regulation. It can't be interpreted by agencies.
Yep, I was actually going to
agree with that.
pipe
Yeah.
in with that because I was thinking about that. Yes, that we
Yeah.
should say that. Yeah. All right, and our last question so far, and I do have to check back to make sure there weren't more, but is an engineering, and I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let Brad answer it anyway, is an engineering study needed prior to putting in a paved recreational surface on in the 100-year floodplain, such as tennis or pickleball courts?
Well, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of how I want to answer it. If this is a question coming from a floodplain administrator, you have to look at what the anticipated impact is going to be. How much grading are we talking about? Are they elevating the surface first and then paving over that? Is it paving at grade? What is the flooding source? How much might that flooding source be impacted by this type of project? If it's larger water bodies take more development to actually impact the flooding elevations associated with them, or if it's next to a lake or something like that. So I'm going to say it depends, but probably no.
Okay.
Thank you. That's good to know, because I didn't know the answer. And how about in a floodway? Probably, right?
In a floodway, yeah.
Yeah.
Any development in a floodway is
Yeah.
going to require no rise analysis.
Right.
But that's a good example of something that you probably could get a no rise pretty easily. You just have to demonstrate that.
Right. Well, good. It's always great to have examples to illustrate these points. Anything else, Monica?
No, other than the person that asked about Army Corps involvement did follow up with, the question is just clarifying that it's related to, buildings versus docks and other structures. So we will get back to them on and do some research on that response. But they obviously were that they wanted to just clarify that it was buildings above the mean high water mark, not other structures.
Okay. Yeah, and for that one, we kind of covered this in one of the slides, but even if let's say that there was some requirements from Army Corps or any other agency for that matter, that still wouldn't preclude the requirement for the local community to issue a floodplain development permit for whatever the activity is. And that it might mean if you're talking about docks and anchoring requirements or potentially variances for some of that development, that would all still apply. So even if they did come to you or come to the town, city, village, whatever, and say, we got this, Army Corps signed off on this, that's great, but you still need to review it at the local level.
Great. All right, I think that covers all the questions, I hope. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody's. Let me just see here.
It does look like
there's
more additional one,
yeah. There was one here. Let's see. One more question maybe here. Our and I haven't read this yet, so I'm just going to read it as I see it. Are floodplain maps updated after developments go in at higher elevations that drain due to impervious surfaces causing runoff?
It's very unlikely. If development takes place outside of the flood hazard area, there's no requirement for a letter of map revision, physical map revision, letter of map change, even a conditional letter of map revision. None of those requirements that would result in a change to the map, none of them apply because the development is outside of that area. Now, you may still want to evaluate and review and permit the development to determine that you're not going to be causing increasing flood hazard risk downstream. That's still something that's within the community's power to do. And also, I'll say all the model local laws you have are going to have some language in there about protecting, minimizing flood damage, which you can kind of point back to if you're getting pushback about why you're requiring maybe an extra level of review for those types of projects, is because you have this responsibility to minimize flood damages. And yes, they may say, well, these regulations, what I just told you, the regulations don't apply outside of the flood hazard area, but there's still more general language, and there's still that responsibility to minimize flooding damages in the entire community, not just in those areas.
Well said, Brad.
All right.
Thank you.
I think that wraps up the questions. Can I just make one pitch to our board members?
Please.
About so one thing I would just say that I wanted to just throw out there is, if you're planning board members or zoning board of appeals, especially members that are seeing more and more development on your water bodies, replacing camps with year-round homes, And you know, as that evolution takes place, which I know a lot of our communities we're seeing that, even if you know you're dealing with the floodplain specifically, you need to get those certificates and all of those things, but also just think about people come for variances because they're on small lots. They had a camp there, now they want to build a twice the size home. More of our waterfronts are being built out. Every time that happens, you're creating more and more imperviousness, whether you're, you know, even if you're not in the floodplain, and some of these things don't have to be considered as board members. It's important that the cumulative effect of all that development, and I know you as boards worry about, well, you know, prior precedents. We've been granting these variances. How do we stop now? We allowed, you know, the 5 prior folks along this stretch of waterfront build. The cumulative effect of all of that really is something to consider, and it may be fine depending upon what you're seeing, but it can be something that over time becomes problematic. So you don't have to be as concerned about precedent if the circumstances have changed in your community. That's a reason to make a different decision, and as long as you document that and make that clear, you can come to a different conclusion on another property owner. So you don't, and we have a course on variances, and we talk about cases where the circumstances changed and boards came to different conclusions on very similar circumstances, and that's okay as long as you can justify your decision. Courts are not going to challenge that if you've documented why you've made your decision. Courts are not necessarily going to frown upon going in a different direction and being concerned about precedent. So just wanted to make that case because this is one of those good courses to talk about that. That's
Great,
it.
Monica. Thank you. And we're 20 minutes over, but with all those questions and discussion, Brad, I have to say, at about 7:30, and I was partly to blame. I was a little worried. I thought we're going to have to skip a whole section, and then you really wrapped it up strong. So thank you for helping us out here. It was really excellent. I learned a lot from you, and I hope we can do this again. Thank you for all your help, and thank you everybody who stayed with us. 20 minutes late, we still have almost 100 people on. Happy holidays, everyone, and we will talk to you. We'll look forward to hearing from you and having you on our webinars on January 6th and January 13th.
Thank you, everybody.
In the meantime,
Thank you.
Thanks for all
happy
your
holidays.
work on your board.